Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Bienvenue. We'll wait a few moments for everyone to connect. All right, welcome et bienvenue à tout le monde. Welcome to the Jubilee 2025 Debt Justice Education Series. My name is Beth Warmer, and I'm the Ecological Justice Program Coordinator at KAIROS Canada. And I have the pleasure of being your MC and moderator this evening, and we're so glad you were able to join us. Interpretation is available in English and French. So if you want to click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select your desired language, l'interprétation est disponible en anglais et en français. Cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation dans le menu au bas de votre écran et sélectionnez la langue souhaitée dans la liste. All right, and before I proceed with tonight's program, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Geneviève Gallant, who is going to ground us and open this session with a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Beth. So I'm joining you this evening from the Rideau River watershed on the ancestral unceded territory of the Omami-Winnie Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Together tonight, we appreciate and respect the land itself and its role in sustaining our lives, and we recognize our reciprocal obligation towards land. Today, 10 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final reports, as we face the injustices both past and present, we pay respect to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and seek to build relationships. We take responsibility for examining our own history and for the work of understanding and challenging the constructs of settler colonialism wherever we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. And I will now pass things over to Sister Pat Carter, who will open us with a prayer.
This is a Thanksgiving prayer. In this golden autumn evening, we turn our hearts in thanksgiving to the many gifts you have given us. However, we also confess our shortcomings as stewards of the gifts. When profit precedes respect for creation, when greed strangles compassion, when impatience outpaces grace, and when ambition overruns wisdom. Let our thanks be infused with a deeper gratitude, a deeper longing to draw closer to you, dear God, a deeper trust in your ways, a deeper commitment to justice, a deeper courage to bring healing to this fractured time. We pray to you, Lord of the harvest, that our hearts will be ever more grateful for all of your abundant gifts. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Pat. Thank you so much for opening us and grounding us with that prayer. Before we continue, welcome to everyone who has just been able to join us. If you require interpretation, please select the globe at the bottom of your screen, and we have interpretation available in English and French. I'll go over a few housekeeping items to help our session run smoothly tonight. To minimize background noise, we've muted participants' microphones. So please stay muted throughout tonight's session. We invite you to share your thoughts and reflections in the chat box. We will keep the chat open, but we ask you to kind of minimize interactions during the presentation so as not to distract our speakers. we will be inviting you to ask questions to our speakers in the chat, and we will have time for a Q&A near the end of the session. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be shared by email with all registrants, as well as presentation materials for our speakers. So you're welcome to take notes, but if there's too much material, don't you worry, we will follow up and make sure that you have the presentation slides from tonight. We'll begin with a brief overview of the series and tonight's session, followed by presentations from two amazing speakers, Marie-Aimée and Dean Detloff. Then we'll have the moderated Q&A, and we'll wrap up with some announcements and ways to support the Jubilee campaign. So welcome here. If you are familiar with the Jubilee campaign, you can raise your hand and we can see how many people are already working on the Jubilee campaign or have signed the petition. We're grateful to have all of you supporting and amplifying this effort this year. Jubilee 2025 is a global and ecumenical initiative that builds on the transformative success of Jubilee 2000, which canceled $100 billion of debt for 36 low-income countries. Countries in the global south face a devastating debt crisis, with many countries spending more on debt repayments than on healthcare, education, or climate action. Jubilee 2025 is mobilizing people of faith and conscience all around the world to call for urgent action to address this crisis. In Canada, KAIROS Canada is leading the campaign in collaboration with Citizens for Public Justice, Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, and the Canadian Council of Churches. This three-part series is intended to provide a deep dive on the debt crisis, as well as Canada's responsibility to see the outcomes of the global petition, which you'll be hearing about in the presentations tonight. Canada is a country that holds responsibility for both its ecological debt to countries in the global south and as a wealthy nation that has influence in multilateral spaces. So throughout this series, we'll be learning about that, but also learning about the impacts of the crisis and hearing from voices in some of our subsequent sessions, voices from the global south. So without further ado, it's time for us to dive. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Marie-Aimée. Marie-Aimée holds a PhD in development economics and is a French citizen who has lived in Asia for over 2 decades. As an economist, she has been deeply engaged with the new international financial and economic architecture, otherwise known as the NIFIA process, through the World Council of Churches. Contributing from the drafting of the Sao Paulo Statement to the present in various capacities, including with the Ecumenical Governance Economic and Management School since its inception in 2016, and where I had the pleasure of learning from her last summer in Nairobi, Kenya. She also holds volunteer governance posts for the Council of World Mission, having served 8 years on its investment committee. And beyond her professional commitments, she is actively involved in humanitarian work as a first responder and in disaster preparedness. So I'll pass things over to you, Marie-Aimée, and I'll just take a moment to show your slides.
Thank you, Beth, and good morning or good evening, everybody. I'm actually logging in from the other side of the world. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I'm 12 hours ahead of you. So actually, I'm speaking to you from Thursday. So I'm talking from the future. So also I'm French, I can speak French. I will conduct my presentation in English for the ease of everybody, and also because the slides are all in English. So I will share with you some basic knowledge related to what is global debt all about. And in order for you to understand the next presenter and 2 other webinars. So let's first dive into what we call global debt, and more importantly, how big is the global debt today? So next. So the global debt is 324 trillion US dollar. So that is a number which is so astronomical that we have very hard time to understand what it is in reality. So on the left, I give you a graph to have a broader idea compared to our GDP. So GDP is the wealth of each country. And here, the global debt at the moment is equivalent or more than 300% of the global GDP of the world. This is what you can read on the right side. If this doesn't speak to you, let me show you a next way of gauging what is 324 trillion debt. Next. If you take a small penny and you pile all the penny over each other, this 324 trillion debt is equivalent of 1.5 trip from Earth to the moon and back. So that gives you how big is the current debt. So 1.5 trip from the Earth to the moon and return. So the first question we may wonder is where this global debt come from? And this is what my next slide is to show you. Contrary to what you may all think, the biggest share of the global debt come from the developed countries. The smallest share come from Africa. Asia and Oceania share a substantive part, or about 20% of the total global public debt. So this graph is quite important because in the public mind, if we ask them to draw this particular graph, they will put the biggest one from Africa and small one for developed countries. But the reality is otherwise. So let's first look at what are the core roots of this global debt pattern. Next. There are 4 main reasons, and the first one is linked to colonial legacy and any historic background those countries may have faced. So I will leave this to Dean, the next speaker, to explain a little bit more. Myself, as an economist, I will focus more on the economic core roots of the debt. So number 2 is economic and policy drivers. During the 80s and also from 2008 to very recently, 2022, the local global interest rates were very low. So this encouraged massive borrowing from government, corporation, and also individual worldwide. Also, in parallel, all the economies, thanks to new technology, have a bigger financialization of the banking system, of the stock market, and so forth. So slowly, what used to be debt for productive investments became debt for consumption and also, more importantly, speculation. Last, you may be familiar with what we call the neoliberal policies, those one who has been pushed by the World Bank, by the IMF, and all those Washington consensus institutions. Usually those policies, they are promoting deregulation, privatization, and that is usually linked to increase of private debt. Next. So the third concern about the core roots are all those crises and emergency response. The major shock we can think of, which we have lived very recently, is the 2008 financial crisis, and even more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. This has pushed a lot of government to borrow heavily for bailout, for stimulus package, and also for emergency spending. We also face increasingly climate change and natural disasters. And the region where I live, we are very, very prone for that. And unfortunately, these have created recurring debt cycle because the nation need to borrow for disaster response and also to rebuild their infrastructure. Next. Last, we also have some systemic issues which explain the core roots of the global debt patterns. More and more, and it's not going to stop under Trump, we have this sort of global imbalance. Some nations are always in deficit, and some nations are more prone to run surplus. And for those who run deficit, they need external financing. We also have currency mismatch, where we have developing nations who need to borrow in foreign currencies, but they earn in local currencies. And that currency mismatch creates a very high vulnerability, especially if there is any exchange rate shock between the borrowing currency and the local currency. And last is exactly the topic of today, is debt servicing. This debt servicing creates a vicious circle where nation needs to borrow just to pay the existing debt obligation. So those are the four main core roots of the global debt pattern. So now, when we are talking about debt, we are here talking in this particular webinar series about sovereign debt. We are not talking about your debt and my own debt and debt-based debt. We are talking about sovereign debt. And what is sovereign debt? Is the money which has been borrowed by a country's government, either from domestic or international sources. So it's the money which has been borrowed from the government. So today we have three types of debt. The number one, we have what we call the survival debt, if you want. This is a debt contracted by the poor nation, and they borrow for their basic need, food, shelter, anything for their survival. The other type of debt, we will call it development debt. This is usually the debt contracted by middle-income countries to finance their growth. So I will say this is quite healthy because usually you need to put money first in order to get your growth and then earn money. Then the last one is what we call speculation debt. This is a debt contracted by the rich nation to finance asset bubble, to speculate on the stock market. Next. So this global debt dynamic is quite important because it has an impact on the national sovereignty of that country. First, on economic dependency. Sometimes when you borrow money, your country's ability to make independent choice, independent political decision is more limited. Second, usually you lose your sovereignty. When a country defaults, because it just cannot pay back its debt, it may have to give control to whatever nation have lent some money, or sometimes worse, they need to give part of their asset, their national asset, to the creditor in exchange of what they should be paying. So when we are talking about this particular issue of debt repayment, we are here talking in economic terms about what we call debt servicing. So what do we call debt servicing? it's the regular payment, meaning it's a monthly basis or quarterly basis, the country need to pay back. And it's composed of two things, the principal and the interest rate. So exactly as when you are borrowing money for your car or for property, you have the principal and then you have interest rate. Okay. And this is why when we are talking about debt, two things are very, very important. The debt currency and the interest rate. Next. So before I speak about those two components, I just want to dive for 2 slides on the role of IMF. Because usually when we are talking about debt and the global south, the first thing we think is about the IMF. So let me just explain briefly what is the role of IMF in this global south debt. So the IMF has a very specific purpose, which is for everybody in the world, every government. Is the minute you have a balance of payments, meaning you have a cash problem, you can turn to the IMF. So to put in a current context, the UK and my own country, France, may have to turn to the IMF because we are highly indebted. So the IMF is not just for the developing countries. Developed countries may also go to it. But a lot of developing countries turn to the IMF when they cannot repay their debt, which they have contracted with other countries or other institutions, or face financial problem to repay the debt they own to the IMF. So that's why we call the IMF the lender of last resort. The problem is there is no free lunch with IMF. When you borrow from the IMF, there is conditionality and governance. So what does it mean? Is I'm lending you money at the IMF, but in exchange of this, you will need to follow what I'm going to tell you on how you are going to collect the money you need to repay me. And the problem here is this recipe to earn money is the same for every country. So that is why very often you will hear one size fits all, meaning the austerity measure which is imposed on the borrowing government by the IMF are usually the same. And they are cut public spending, privatize everything, open the market, and usually this has a very high cost in terms of health, education, and social protection in that particular countries. So of course, as you can imagine, the borrowing country has lost their space for policy and their own priorities. So here come the debt payment challenge. Usually those countries cannot pay back. They're what we call the account, the way the austerity measures are imposed on them, just push further their poverty, they push for social unrest, and the payment become harder and harder. So those countries just end up in a cycle of debt. Next. So this is just to show you who owns the most debt from the IMF. Usually we always think it's just Africa, but not. This is the latest statistic, and as of today, Argentina is the biggest debtor of the IMF, with no less than almost 30%. The second one is no less than Ukraine. Okay? The rest is very clearly indicated on the right. But what you need to know as a general idea is the top 10 countries, which are in that graph, alone account for about 2/3 or about 70% of the top IMF outstanding credits. So it's highly concentrated. So you may ask next, where the debt is from? And here is a culprit. the majority of the debt, or 1/3 of the global debt, is owned by the United States. Next is China, then is Japan. So what we see here is developed countries. And who do they own that debt? If we just look at the US, they own it to Japan, China, and the rest of the world for 1.6 trillion. So the major country in debt is not the one we may think, and mainly in Africa or Latin America, is nothing else than the US. So you may wonder, how come? Why the US have this luxury with nobody saying anything to be so highly indebted? Well, it's quite easy answer. Next is because they own the US dollar. The power of the US dollar until today, even the renminbi, the euro are trying to break through, is still number one. Why? It's because when people borrow, it's usually in US dollar. So the own currency, look, the reason is because their own currency are not in global demand. So you have to borrow in a money which is in a global demand. So more or less, I will say is euro, the renminbi a little bit, the yen, and more specifically, the US dollar. Second reason why the US dollar is so important is because the vast majority of the reserve currency, so meaning the foreign reserve in every central bank in the world, are in US dollar, about 60%. Okay, why? Is because the majority of the trade between the various countries in the world are done for 40% in US dollar. So when you trade in US dollar, you earn more dollar. And what do you save in your coffer? US dollar. Okay. And why is it so? Because the commodity pricing for oil, gold, and any major commodities, especially produced by the global south, are priced in US dollar. And the stock market for this, if you want to speculate on it, is in Chicago, in the US. So in short, all the countries need dollar to trade. Now, the exchange rate risk is also very important. When the local currency are weakened against the US dollar, automatically their debt become more expensive. Because again, it's because the debt is labeled in US dollar. So the problem comes from those countries indebted in the global south is when there is a dollar scarcity. When they cannot earn enough by trade to have enough US dollar in their central bank. Because if they don't have enough global reserve, they don't have enough money to repay back in US dollar. So this means the power of the US dollar, you can see it globally because there's ripple effects. Any change in the US dollar exchange rate or in the US dollar interest rate will shape the debt across cost and repayment worldwide. Next. So here is the second biggest thing you need to keep in mind when we are talking about global debt, is the interest rate. And that is why you may wonder, if you're not economist, why at the end of the year or whenever the Fed leader, so now it's Powell, the photo is below, is so important. Everyone, every stock market, every businessman, every investor, every government is just holding. What is the US going to do with the US interest rate? Because the interest rate given by the Fed is the leading interest rate for the world. When it's announced, all the bank in the world, including the European Bank, will follow this interest rate. So the Fed US interest rate is a global benchmark. So that is very important. Because the risk premium, which is how much someone is willing to pay according to the risk of the country, depend on that particular interest rate. The higher the risk, the higher the interest rate. So if the benchmark go higher, the highest risk also go higher. And who has to pay this? The government who have borrowed money, those governments who are in debt. The yield curve is also very important. What it is? The yield curve is a difference between the short-term money I can borrow and the long-term money I can borrow or invest in. So when the interest rate in the US dollar goes up, it means me, as an investor, is getting quite interesting. So all my money, instead of going and being invested in the global south, is going to run to the US because the interest rate is higher. I will earn more. So meaning the global fund, the global investor could potentially be investing somewhere else, is just interested by this yield curve. The interest rate in the US is more attractive than anywhere else. Last, what is very important about interest rates is the difference between fixed and variable interest rate. I don't know about yourself. When you go to the bank to borrow some money, you may be offered two choices. Either it's a fixed interest rate, 5%, and from today until the end of your loan, maybe 20 years, you will always pay 5%, whether the interest rate goes up or goes down. But more often, because the banks make money out of you, they will offer you only what we call a variable interest rate. Today you sign up at 2%, but tomorrow, if interest rate from the Fed increase at 8%, what you will have to reimburse will be at 8%. And unfortunately, when the global south borrow money, it's at variable interest rate. So today it's at 2%, they can afford to pay back. But tomorrow, because Trump suddenly decided to increase or ask the Fed to increase their interest rate, those countries have to pay back a much more higher amount, which they didn't plan. Next. And this is where we go to what we call debt dynamic and interest rate effect. The debt service coverage is exactly what I'm talking about. Is slowly, when the interest rate rise, that automatically increase your debt to your GDP ratio, meaning you are now earning more, but what you have to pay back for your debt is increasing. So meaning your debt ratio is increasing. And what do the investors look at? They look at that particular numbers. When this number increase, your risk increase. So whoever will lend you money will ask you for more interest rate. Because if I want to give you money, to loan you money, my risk is getting higher. So that's why countries who cannot face to pay back at the moment need to refinance their debt. And their refinancing risk is getting higher just because the new interest rate is higher. Okay? So that brings to a pro-cyclical capital flows. The rate hike trigger sudden stop of capital flow to this particular country, which need even more capital to reimburse. But because it's a more risky country, either less people go there or they ask for higher interest rate. And then we go for this cycle. The sovereign spread widening, meaning the risk premium is getting higher and higher, and that will slowly have an impact of the fiscal constraint to that particular country. Because when the country needs to pay a higher debt service, this automatically crowd out any productive sort of government spending for development. Next and last, another unfairness in the world. Beside the fact that the US is the one owning the US dollar, the one more or less guiding the benchmark of interest rate, which will guide this repayment amount. The US is the most indebted countries, but the one with the lowest borrowing cost. The latest borrowing cost available as of April 2025, so just a few months ago, as you can see on the slide, is only 2.8%. Africa, because it's considered a very high-risk country. Why? Because the debt over their GDP ratio is very, very high. They have to pay a minimum of 8.9% for whatever borrowing they are asking for. And in between, you have Asia and Latin America. So overall, on average, the world have to pay at the moment 6.5% whenever they want to borrow money. Okay? So I will end up here with one narrative, if you want to put it this way. The various routes created the vulnerability, which I have mentioned during my talk. But as of today, the dollar dominance and the US interest rate policy are the daily mechanism that can trigger or resolve the debt crisis. So I will leave you with this narrative, and that particular slide will lead the way to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marie-Aimée. I hope everyone can send her some claps for walking us through that.
If you survive.
We're in our evening time, so I hope our brains were able to absorb that after maybe a long day. And for Marie-Aimée, she just woke up and this all just comes pouring out as soon as the sun comes up for her. So grateful. I've heard you speak and kind of give this lecture before, and I'm grateful for your clarity on the topic. We're going to hold all of our questions for both speakers at the end. So if you do have a question, though, please, you can write it out in the chat or just hold it, and we will call on people who have their hands raised after we hear from our next speaker. But I hope everyone will just take a moment to digest all of that amazing material. Maybe you need to turn off your camera and just stretch or stand up or do something to kind of refresh your brain. But for those who want to perhaps just engage in a question, I thought in between speakers, I would pose a question to our group just to kind of spur some discussion and some reflection on what you've been hearing. So my question to you, and I encourage you to put it in the chat, your response: what's more harmful, debt or the conditions attached to repaying it? So you're welcome. We've included that question in English and French in the chat for you to review, and then I encourage you to put your response in the chat if you'd like. Okay, so we are going to keep moving, and it is my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker and my colleague, Dean Detloff. Dean is the Research and Advocacy Officer at Development and Peace, KAIROS Canada, which is a Catholic movement for international solidarity. He has helped coordinate and organize the global Jubilee campaign, Turn Debt into Hope, supported by over 100 international organizations and a growing multitude of individuals around the world. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, where he also teaches classes on themes related to liberation theology and social justice. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Marie-Aimée, for such a wonderful presentation. And I learned a lot too. And yes, I appreciate everyone trying your best to keep your minds engaged. Global economics is hard to make interesting, but we'll do our very best. And I'm going to share my slides here in an effort to make it a little more interesting. And let's see, I can see Marie-Aimée on my screen. If you can see my presentation, could you just give me a thumbs up? Oh, perfect. I see Sister Pat too. Fantastic. Thank you. So my presentation is titled Life or Debt, Economic Justice in the Jubilee Year. And I'm going to try to kind of highlight some of the inequalities in the global financial system and continue drawing out some of the story that Marie-Aimée has already been telling us. And then I want to pivot a little bit to talking about this campaign, this Turn Debt into Hope campaign, and what exactly we can do in such a bizarre, challenging, complex situation. So that will be my goal. By the end of today, hopefully you'll feel like, all right, there's something I could do to deal with this very complicated international problem. Some quick stats just to remind us of the state of the problem. Currently, 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more money on interest than on health or education. And you can see a breakdown of some of these graphs here. The key factor being here, all the money that's going to interest, to paying the interest on the debt, is money that's not going to these key development indicators, to health or education. And I think that's a really key message of our campaign. We want to ask that kind of moral question when it comes to how our global economy is prioritizing the ways that people interact with economics, the benefits that they receive from international trade and commodities and all these complicated things. When we start to review that, the picture that we get is that, in fact, people are not benefiting to the degree that they ought to on these key sectors. So that's health and education. To maybe add even a little bit more here, the situation is not any better when it comes to investment in climate change. This report comes from Miserior, which is a kind of our German sister organization, a Catholic development organization. And in a debt monitor they put out last year, they noted that in 2023, expenditures for debt servicing in countries of the global south were in fact 12.5 times higher than their expenditures for tackling the effects of climate change. On average, countries in the global south spend only 2.5% of their government revenue on strengthening their climate resilience. In contrast, just under 33% of government revenue is used to service debt. And of course, this is especially challenging because it's countries in the global south who are facing the effects of climate change the most, despite contributing to it the least. So the debt situation is removing their ability to respond at a crucial moment. Now, this chart might look a little bizarre, but a question that we often have in the debt campaign, especially from people who remember the Jubilee debt campaign in Jubilee 2000, is what exactly is different today as opposed to 25 years ago? And there are lots of differences. I'll talk about a few as we go, but I think this is a really key big one. So I'll take the time to kind of parse out this chart a little bit. What you're seeing here is a trend in the graph going from 2008 to 2021. And you can see some of the colors on this graph are getting a bit wider over time. So the dark and light blue represent official creditors. So multilateral official creditors, the dark blue, would be things like the IMF, as Marie-Aimée was talking about, the World Bank, etc. And official creditors would be bilateral creditors. So that might be money owed to another country, for example, directly. Now, the yellow is private creditors who are bondholders, and many different private creditors could hold a bond. An asset management company like BlackRock, for example, might buy up a bunch of bonds that have been sold by a country to try to finance their development, or they might be held by private creditors in terms of banks. And you can see that since 2008, if you look at this the line in 2008, the majority of creditors are in the blues, right? Dark blue and light blue. So so-called official creditors. And those creditors ostensibly are somewhat accountable to us as citizens, to regular people, right? I can go to the government of Canada and say, I think that you should reconsider your debt. I can ask the government of Canada to go to the IMF and say, you should reconsider your debt. Private creditors are not really accountable to us. And so that means that the situation of who owns the debt and who we need to kind of call up and convince has changed pretty dramatically since 2000, but also even more recently since 2008. How do we kind of summarize the effects here? I think there was a really helpful summary in a statement that came from an expert group of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences. The Vatican had kind of called together these economists to think through the debt crisis. And they said the prevailing view that if a country does not default, there's not a debt crisis is flawed. Debt-distressed countries are defaulting on economic development as they prioritize debt payments over critical public investments in education, health, the environment, and infrastructure, jeopardizing the development and well-being of their people. Current debt and economic policies in many debt-distressed countries are serving financial interests rather than the people. And I think this is one of those headline slides that countries are defaulting on development. They may not be en masse defaulting on their debt. Some have, in fact, defaulted on their debt. But what they are defaulting on is development. So instead of paying for healthcare and education, they're paying back the debt rather than the other way around. And that's a big challenge. Marie-Aimée, excuse me, Sarah had said that she would pass the baton to me to talk a little bit about some of these historical root causes of where did this debt come from? What are the kind of inequalities that make up this debt situation that we have today? And you could do a whole presentation on only that, but I'll try to sort of sum it up in a slide here. The first is that colonial capitalism, when it emerged, colonized people and places were economically arranged to provide inputs for colonial centers rather than their own good. So when Europeans were going to places like the Americas or Africa or Asia, it's not like they went to, so-called Canada today in order to create a country called Canada in the interest of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, or in the interest even of creating a country called Canada. They went to these other places in the interest of their own countries. So England and France, for example, in the case of Canada. And as countries had kind of gotten out under the thumb of their colonial powers or achieved some kind of independence, that history remained. So for many, many countries, their economies were set up to benefit someone else. So they might have become politically independent, but not necessarily economically independent. So that left their economies stunted. So they're dependent on an infrastructure designed to export key commodities abroad, the things that make them money. So again, independence didn't mean total freedom. It created the conditions for debt. Here's just one interesting case. Haiti, one of the first countries to really throw off the colonial rule in our own kind of neck of the woods here in this part of the world. Haiti was required to pay France 150 million gold francs in exchange for its independence. And it took Haiti over 140 years to pay that debt. And even today, Haitians and advocates have called for reparations from France to say that that was unfair to sort of put Haitians in debt to pay a bill for their own freedom. When countries try to do an alternative model, they're often punished in a variety of ways. So that might be through economic isolation, things like sanctions and so on. It could be through political opposition. In the kind of worst or most egregious cases, it would involve even things like violence or assassinations. So you can think of the many, many leaders in the 20th century, for example, who were trying to take their country down another path of development. And the sort of global North hegemony decided that that was not a good development, and they intervened in a violent way, undermining their sovereignty, undermining their ability to get out from those root causes of colonialism. So with economies shaped for underdevelopment, countries in the global south need to borrow capital in order to make up the gaps. So they are already behind, so they're borrowing capital to try to catch up. They face higher borrowing rates, as Marie-Aimée already showed us, And that continues the colonial pattern of developing their economies in order to enrich colonial centers. And there's many, many ways that that happens, but debt is a big one. To kind of keep talking about the IMF, just to give you one example of one of these big unequal institutions, the IMF has always had a European as a managing director, and the World Bank has almost always had a US American president. So you can see the lists here on the left, the IMF, most of them coming from countries in Europe, well, all of them in Europe. And on the right, the World Bank, almost everybody from the US with a sort of quick break in 2019. And I think that that tells us something really instructive about how the world is arranged and who is in the driver's seat of arranging it. To kind of stick with the IMF and World Bank, both of these institutions are structured by membership. So members have a particular allocation of votes. And in the World Bank, the United States has so much weight that its vote effectively amounts to a veto power. So you can see in the chart on the right, the US has 15.44% of the votes. And combined, EU countries equal up to just under the amount of say from the US. There's lots of other things to say about it, but it's a pretty obviously tilted institution. And I thought I would just also draw out the Canadian piece of all this for folks who are curious. At the World Bank, Canada actually represents a number of different countries. You can see them listed on the slide, and you can have the slides afterwards. What that means is Canada is actually the only G7 country that represents both lenders. So Canada and Ireland are lender countries, but also borrowers in the Caribbean, countries who are borrowing at the World Bank and the IMF. So in fact, Canada has a really kind of strange and interesting role to play at the World Bank. And so we represent not only ourselves, but the interests of others as well. The IMF situation is not much different. Members, again, they have a share, kind of like a shareholder. What this means is that countries, it's not like the United Nations, right? Where at the UN, it's one country, one vote. It's a kind of democratic space in that way. At the IMF and the World Bank, it's pretty obviously kind of drawn in these unequal ways. So there's an unequal distribution of power that favors the US and Europe. It's not reflective of global populations. It's not deliberatively democratic. And yet the IMF and the World Bank are sort of two institutions that kind of come up with the rules of the best way to run a country, the best way to deal with the debt crisis, and so on. On the topic of debt as well, as Marie-Aimée mentioned, when we talk about sovereign debt, there's many kinds of sovereign debts, and including debt for development, which is not necessarily always bad, although it can kind of run away without people expecting it. But I think that these kinds of conversations around sovereign debt, they raise an important question for us. When we hear about debts or loans, we might assume that all loans are at least at first given in good faith. There's a mutual transaction there. But a lot of loans become what we could call odious debt, which means that they were given in an unjust way right at the beginning, or they have become unjust because of their conditions. So some ways that we could consider a debt to be odious might be the debt was taken out not for the needs and interests of the state or the people, and it might even have been taken out against those interests. So it might have been used to oppress the population, building up a security force, or enrich a corrupt regime, etc. Unfortunately, lots of cases of that happening. It could be odious if creditors knew that the debt would not be used in the interest of people at the time of the loan. So maybe in the first example, the creditors could get away with saying, well, we didn't know it was going to end up being used for something nefarious. Well, in many cases, creditors do in fact know, but that doesn't really seem to stop them from giving out a loan. Or thirdly, a debtor state does not represent or respect fundamental human rights. If that's the case, then the loan already we might consider as odious, which is to say it's not really going to development. It's not the case that all debts are kind of given in the perfect conditions of mutuality and trust. There are many cases where a debt is given in already odious sorts of ways or become odious over time. This is all very complicated. I think when you look at these debt issues, they can feel kind of insurmountable. And yet, 25 years ago, Jubilee 2000 showed us and I think proved that they're not necessarily insurmountable. Jubilee 2000 is remembered as the most successful grassroots campaign in Canadian history. And not just by us who are movements who are part of it, but in social movement literature and so on, it's often held up. 640,000 Canadians signed a global petition for debt justice, and Canada came to be seen as a global leader, and in fact, it set up its own Canadian debt initiative to cancel its bilateral debts. And I had found this picture below in doing a little archival research of some development and peace members leading a debt cancellation rally in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in 1999. A very impressive moment. I was 10 years old at the time, not to make anybody feel old on this webinar, but I can tell you that I find it very inspiring to this day, kind of hearing the stories of what happened in Jubilee 2000. And the key is that, again, it proved that you could, in fact, gain a win in such a complicated international situation. One of those big wins is that the Jubilee campaign led to the establishment of something called the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative at the IMF, or it's often called HIPC. To date, as Beth said at the top of the webinar, over $135 billion in debt has been canceled for 36 countries through this initiative, and that was a pretty big victory for many. At the same time, the victory didn't come without kind of some big asterisks. So countries often had to agree to economic policy conditions in order to receive that debt cancellation, privatizing key aspects of their economies. So just to give you a few examples here, in Zambia, the IMF said that they had to privatize their bank in order to receive debt cancellation. They refused that at first, but then there was a famine and the debt went up, and so they relented. Senegal refused enhanced status, meaning, one more means of kind of lowering their debt burden until it privatizes its state-run peanut business. So again, trying to kind of pull out in a certain way that commodity revenue from the public and put it in private hands. And you can see many other examples here: Ghana, Rwanda, Guyana, Honduras. Tanzania, many of these countries, they did receive debt cancellation, and that was important. But often, in order to receive it, it kind of set them up for other problems down the road. So it's a kind of mixed victory, and I think that's instructive for how we talk about debt and what to do about it today. It means we have to be very vigilant with decision makers. Why don't creditors cancel debt? I'll give you just one example. I mentioned BlackRock as a bondholder. It's an asset management company. Debt Justice UK, some friends of ours, asked them that very question in a public way. Why don't you just cancel the debt? And BlackRock said that it had a strong history of a responsible and constructive participant in debt restructuring. It had a shared interest in reaching a deal. But, a spokesperson said, BlackRock is a long-term investor in emerging market sovereigns on behalf of our clients. As a fiduciary, the money we invest on their behalf is not our own. It is predominantly the money of ordinary people saving for retirement, and we have to act in their best financial interest at all times. And for that reason, we cannot unilaterally forgive sovereign debt. So this is quite a complicated thing to parse out, because I think if you ask most of those ordinary people saving for retirement, if they thought that their retirement should depend on people in Zambia, for example, not having access to healthcare or education, they would probably say no. They'd probably say, I think there should be a better investment than that, but we don't really have the opportunity to make that decision. BlackRock makes the decision for us if our pensions, for instance, are held by that asset management firm. So it's a complicated structure that many of us are also embedded in. Why don't countries default? There are some exceptions. Some countries have defaulted. I'll just give you a very, very brief explanation to why countries don't default. I'm not going to read this whole slide. You can look at it in detail, but I'll summarize at least kind of three factors. So why doesn't a country just quit paying if they're in such a pickle, such a problem? The first reason is that if debtor countries don't repay, they could face a consequence, like losing out on opportunities for money in the future. So if you're an investor and you say, Well, Argentina didn't pay their loan, then maybe you won't give them a loan again. And that might make decision makers afraid to kind of lose that potential to receive investments. Also, lenders like the IMF keep lending to countries that are in debt distress so that those countries can pay back their creditors. So you might say, you call the IMF and you say, we're in big trouble, we can't pay our loans. The IMF will say, don't worry, I'll give you enough money to pay those loans, and then you'll owe us at the IMF, maybe at a lower rate, for example. But in order to do that, you'll likely also have to agree to some of these conditionalities. So effectively, the IMF is actually bailing out private creditors at the expense, again, of the people. And then finally, political leaders who are more sympathetic to austerity or a neoliberal framework tend to be rewarded with more credit. And one example might be Argentina, for example, where Milei, who's been pushing forward these neoliberal policies, has been rewarded by both the IMF and now by the US, even though he's not exactly putting the interests of Argentine people on their own in the long term at the forefront of those kinds of policies. So what else can be done? We have this petition campaign first off, but I think a lot of people ask us, well, what else is there and what can countries even do beyond a petition like ours? I'll just give you a few examples of things that kind of come up in the debt movement, especially in the global south. One is the example of debt audits. So how could a country determine what debts should be canceled and what debts are legitimate? In the early 2000s, Ecuador created a commission that included representatives from civil society, grassroots organizations, and experts to examine whether and how much of its debt could be considered odious. And at the time, President Rafael Correa announced a pause in paying 2/3 of the country's debt following that analysis. So debt audits are one kind of suggestion. Could the people be involved in figuring out what debts seem reasonable? We might also strengthen the loss and damage fund, so investing more public money into things like compensation for climate change, and also breaking with neoliberalism. So there's an assumption that the private sector is kind of the ultimate key to solving social problems. And that has led to decades of failure to create just and equitable societies. International finance and national economies have to rediscover the role of public planning and financing of common goods instead of just entrusting everything to the market. And I think, if you just turn on the news these days, you'll discover that that kind of assumption that the private sector is really the key, mobilizing private finance and so on, is unfortunately still alive and well. So a lot of work to be done there. So these are three things kind of beyond the petition campaign that sort of get talked about in the global debt movement. Now, I think that it's easy to get lost in the technical details of international finance and debt, but the issue is not really that complex when you kind of break it down into its simplest parts, and that's what I'm going to do to close here. I took this striking image. It's by a Cuban artist, and you can see that it's Christ being crucified on a dollar sign that marks the IMF, and it's a Christ who is kind of a common person. And at the bottom, you see it's foreign debt is kind of the title here. And one way of describing what this painting is getting at is to say that debt is contributing to what a martyred Jesuit priest named Ignacio Ellacuría had called the crucified people of the world. Jubilee 2025 is our chance to intervene in the ongoing injustice and say that the futures of populations should be tied to justice and not just the profit of creditors. And that's what we bring as a faith-based movement to this conversation. Economists bring the technical possibilities. Politicians, they bring negotiating power. We, as faith movements, bring this kind of moral clarity to what's really at stake in the debt crisis. I'll give you one other example here, and it came to me by way of a colleague in Malawi who had shared it in a planning meeting. And she quoted Thomas Sankara, a revolutionary leader from Burkina Faso, who said, "Debt cannot be repaid, first, because if we don't repay, lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we repay, we are going to die, and that is also for sure." And I think it really is as simple as Sankara had put it in the 1980s, that if debt doesn't get repaid, the creditors are going to survive. But if debt continues to be repaid, it can mean literally the difference between life and death, right? You don't have access to healthcare, you don't have access to education, infrastructure, etc. And I'll kind of leave you with one other important moral voice here. Pope Francis, in his document announcing the Jubilee year of 2025, he said that more than a question of generosity, this is a matter of justice. And he's talking about the cancellation of debts. And again, I think that is the message that we bring as people of faith in a faith-based movement. It's not a question of generosity, of rich companies or, excuse me, rich countries sort of, giving in charity to poor countries somewhere else. It's a question of justice. Countries are in debt because of an unjust system. And what we can say is that it is unjust and that it has to be corrected, that it has to be changed. And that's what the Turn Debt into Hope campaign is really about, is trying to make that clear to decision makers that we think that this is fundamentally unjust and we think they have a responsibility to fix that. That is it for me. I'll leave it with Pope Francis, a good note to end on.
Thank you so much, Dean. And again, I had a sneak preview of this presentation earlier this year at the Jubilee People's Forum and knew that we needed to widen the audience because I really appreciated Dean's clarity in kind of walking us through some of the complexities of the colonial impact and those impacts of capitalism. And also ending on that really wonderful points of moral clarity that this faith-based movement brings to the campaign. So thank you both again, Marie-Aimée and Dean. I invite anyone who has questions for either speaker to put them into the chat. And to begin, I was just going back through the chat to make sure that I caught questions maybe after Marie-Aimé's presentation. And I do have a question for you, I think from Taddy, and Taddy's asking, I've heard that the high risk of lending to Africa is mostly a perceived risk, and that in fact, African countries do not default more than anywhere else. Is this true? And either Marie-Aimée or Dean, you can respond to that if you have an opinion to that or an answer.
That's a good question. So when we are talking about default risk, usually we refer when it's a chance that a borrower will not be able to pay his debt. Okay. So now there are different categories of risk and different category of perception. So when we hear this kind of thing, we have to be very, very careful because there are the official risk, which is based on an economic indicator. But you have also those risks which are being decided by rating agencies. And we know how they have failed miserably in the Asian crisis, in the 2008 crisis. And there are also all those media people, because you have the perception of risk. And this perception of risk is usually based on who is at the head of the state, whether there is corruption or whatever. So we have to be very careful when we are talking about those risks. Now, in terms of risk, Africa, yes, has a very high default risk. And Dean has mentioned some countries which recently default, Ghana, Zambia. But there is a lot of countries in Europe who have been worse in defaulting their debt payments. So Africa is not the worst when we are pointing always at Africa. Latin America is also quite bad. So is it high risk for Africa? Yes, I would say surely. But when we are looking at it, we have to be very cautious about whether it's a perceived risk or whether it's really a currency risk, a volatility risk linked to commodity export, or is it a global risk linked to contagion effect? So it's not a yes or no. It's Africa is taken as a whole, but there is many countries in Africa. Some have default, some are doing quite well. So it has to be taken very cautiously.
Maybe also just to add one bit on the perception piece when it comes to risk is in our global order, it's usually the borrower who is perceived to be risky. But in theory, a loan is a mutual risk. A lender is also making a bet, right? They're taking a risk themselves, assuming that they will be paid back. Lenders usually they lend with the desire to be paid back. But in our global system, it's the debtor who is always punished. So if the risk actually materializes, which is what the interest rate is supposed to quantify, it's the debtor who ends up taking on the real burden of it. And one message of the campaign is to say that's unfair. It was a risk that was shared at the beginning, but it's not a risk that's shared when the problem actually emerges. And who ends up paying the bill for it? It's the person in a position that is worse off than the lender. And that seems unfair. So just to kind of add also, we have a kind of ideological story we tell about debt that says, well, you just have to pay the debt back. It's always the debtor's fault. But the risk is shared. The consequences are not shared.
Thank you. Yeah, that's that kind of turns things on its head a little bit in the way we think about the borrower-lender relationship. And to that, speaking of defaulting, there's a question from Richard. One country with a large debt is the US. What would be the collateral damage if the US were to decide to default on their debt or forget their own debt? So shortly, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that doomsday question.
They won't default. So if you are following the news, because you are up north and they are down south to you, at the moment there is a default for the states. I mean, the Congress is not passing the budget required by Trump. And because of this, the state is considered as default and the civil servants are not currently paid. But this is internal. It's every year we hear the same story. And every year, after a bit of few weeks of suspense, suddenly the money is coming from somewhere. Now, until the US dollar is a major global currency, the US will not default. And even we have the worst global financial crisis, and we have seen this up and down over the past decade. Where do the investors always turn back, regardless the situation, is to the US. The US bond and all this will never default. So that question is a good question, but to me, and I don't know what you think, Dean, but until the US dollar is a leading currency, the US by default cannot default. They will just print money, as they did many times. Because don't forget, the IMF, and I said it and you pointed further, Dean, they are very good at giving lesson to everybody. But when it comes to their own country, who are facing crisis, who are in debt, blah, 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 there is no principle of the IMF who applies anymore. They need money, they just print money. So that's why it's not so soon that the US will default. Unfortunately, that would be a good lesson otherwise.
I think you said it well.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question from Alan, one that I think many of us have been posing to ourselves as we continue to strategize about advocacy with the Canadian government. But what motivates lenders to cancel loans? So that is a big question. I don't know it's hard to maybe speculate on that one. But yeah, Dean, I don't know if you have any thoughts coming out for you on that.
I can try, and Marie-Aimée, you can help me out too. Yeah, well, it is somewhat speculative. You know, the challenge is when it comes to governments, it's easier to have that conversation because governments can be motivated for many different reasons. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, even if a government is not good at listening to civil society, at least you can meet with them and make a case. You know, like I can and we have, as the Jubilee campaign, met with the Canadian government to lay out reasons, which, you know, you have to find reasons that appeal to the government, but you can have a conversation that's wider than just, you know, you owe money and you should pay me back or whatever. You can have a kind of what's the right thing to do conversation. When it comes to private lenders, it's much harder. Private lenders are not really motivated to cancel loans. They're motivated to be paid. And there are maybe two challenges with that. One is, as I said, the IMF sort of provides a bailout in some cases where the private lenders are kind of secured. Like if they just hold on, they'll get paid by somebody, whether it's the country or the IMF or whatever. They're not really motivated to cancel. The other piece, though, is they could be motivated to restructure a debt. It's better to get paid a little bit less than to get paid nothing at all. But because the creditor landscape is so fragmented, there are so many different kinds of creditors, it's hard to get them all in one place and have everyone agree at the same time to restructure their debt all at once. And this has been a strategy that the G20 countries have tried for about 5 years now, and nobody can seem to make it work. So if you want my opinion, unless there is a change in international regulations around debt, you're not going to find creditors out of the goodness of their hearts voluntarily canceling their debt. It just doesn't make sense for them to do it. It's better for them to just wait and hold on because they will be paid. And that's what they're in the business of doing is getting paid.
Thanks, Dean.
Yeah, and I will add one of the argument is the debt which are not paid doesn't help anyone. Number one, it can just bring and lead chaos and destabilize maybe not the whole world, but a region. So some country may use, I will say, so I'm talking from an economic perspective, they will use more like a geopolitical or strategic interest. You know, okay, I will forgive your debt, but in exchange, let's have some sort of strategic alliance. You know, it can be on defense or maritime alliance or something like this. One thing which can be eventually done, but it's more from people like all of us here, is we can move from an environmental and development initiative. If I'm not mistaken, the Seychelles in the late 2018, something like that, or 2016, it was an exchange between the debtor, the creditor, and the Seychelles. And in exchange of the debt forgiveness, they were supposed to protect the marine ecosystem. So that could be one way. Now we are under this climate change and the government tried to be into it, but they more or less fail, especially the developed countries. Maybe one way would be to have this kind of debt cancellation linked to ecological or social commitments between the two. That may be an approach, you know, so debt for climate, so to speak.
Great, thank you. I see a few more questions are coming in, and I am going to try to move us along. So I think to Brenda, I'm happy for Dean to respond directly to Brenda, maybe in the chat, but I did just want to point out that the third session in our series is going to kind of look at those international rules and that mechanism. So please join us again in 2 weeks on the 22nd to learn more about the case that we're making for some of those rules to be established within the UN. But Dean can respond more closely if he has more to add on that. And I think there was a question from Susanna up earlier. So I think what we'll do around what can all of you do in this room to help amplify this campaign. And so I think that's where I'd like to turn us next. And so I'm just going to once again thank Marie-Aimée and Dean so much for their presentations, for their commitment and time in putting that together for us, and everyone can send them another clap in the Zoom room and some love. Thank you. So thank you again so much. It was really wonderful having you both here and hearing your different perspectives on this, and I think it complemented quite nicely. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the what can we do next? All right, so the most powerful next step, and hoping if you have not already done so, I hope everyone in this event tonight has signed the petition. My colleagues will be putting a link to it in the chat if you have not. But the most powerful next step that you can take is to invite others in your community to sign the petition too. The goal of the Canadian campaign is to reach 100,000 signatures in Canada. So that this is a global petition, and Canada is trying to commit to contributing 100,000 signatures to that global petition. And your outreach here can make all the difference. So even if you can get, we're over, I'm hoping one of my colleagues can put the number in, but I know we're around 43,000. So if everyone who's signed the petition had at least one other person or two other people sign it, we would be way over target. So that is my challenge to everyone in this space tonight. And here are just a few other ways in which you can get to 100,000. So you'll start to see a lot of links being put in the chat, and I'll speak to each of them. You can share the petition link on your social media or in your community newsletter. There is a link to an amplification toolkit that has template messaging that you can easily copy and paste on all platforms, in newsletters, and on social media. There's also graphics that are linked within there that you can use, or you can take a selfie of you signing the petition somehow and share that out as well. You can host a conversation or small gathering in your faith community, school, or local group to talk about why this campaign matters. And to help you with that, go to the Animators Toolkit, which has sample scripts and presentation slides and other information that you can use to guide your presentation. That toolkit will soon be available in French. Some of the pieces are linked here already that have been translated, but that whole Animators Toolkit will be available in French very soon. And we thank you for your patience. The Animators Toolkit also includes paper petitions that you can print out and bring to your church or community event and have people sign on paper. There's worship resources, graphics, and much more. And so we use those to invite others to take part in the campaign as well. There are 2 upcoming opportunities that are perfectly designed to help you amplify the Jubilee campaign and to help us reach that 100,000 signatures. First, from October 12th to 19th and up to November 10th, please join us in the Proclaim Jubilee initiative. This is timed to align with the 2025 World Bank and IMF annual meetings that are running soon from October 13th to 18th in Washington, D.C. And will kind of end on November 10th when the UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, begins in Belém, Brazil. And later that month, the G20 meetings on November 22nd to 23rd. So participation in Proclaim Jubilee is simple. All you need is a group of people and some way to include a horn. There's more information if you're curious on what I've just said. To participate in Proclaim Jubilee, there is a link that Cheryl is adding to the chat about that. So I encourage you to go look at that and see if you can pull something together in your community. The second from November 14th to 16th, which is the Global Weekend of Action for Climate Justice and the middle weekend of that UN Climate Conference that I mentioned. There are two initiatives taking part, which are kind of we're doing it jointly in terms of promoting them. So one is Candles for COP, and the second is Jubilee Walks. So For the Love of Creation, which is a faith-based initiative in Canada for climate justice, invites groups across Canada to host candlelight vigils in their communities on that weekend. And this is a time to reflect and share our love for the planet, and also share our hopes for transformative action to take place at that conference. It's also an excellent opportunity for you to talk about debt justice and how it links to creating space for countries to invest in climate action, and a great way to invite people to sign the petition. So we invite you to take a look at the Candles for COP website and see if you can host something in your community. That same weekend, Development and Peace, Caritas Canada invites you to organize a walk in your community to show solidarity with people living in countries in the global south that are facing the impacts of the debt crisis. Maybe your vigil and your walk can be something that you do together, or maybe it's one or the other. We invite you to participate as you are able, and whatever kind of sparks some motivation for you. So those are lots of, I think, ways to kind of keep us going and keep the momentum building. And I hope to see everyone who is here tonight, and I hope you invite some others, if you enjoyed tonight's programming, to invite some friends to the next two sessions. So next week on October 15th, our second session will be Restoring Justice, Ecological Debt and Canada's Fair Share. And we'll be joined next week by speakers from Acción Ecológica, one of KAIROS' solidarity partners in Ecuador, and one of kind of the key organizations involved in defining ecological debt. So I encourage everyone to be there for that. We'll also have two speakers from Canada, from the Climate Action Network, and from the Padma Center for Climate Justice, to help us walk through Canada's fair share and how we can be responding. So please do join us for that. And thank you again, everyone, for your participation tonight. Please know that we did record, and we will be sharing that recording with everyone following tonight's program, as well as the presentations from both Marie-Aimée and Dean. So thank you again.